speakers. Good to go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Rob Fenstermacher. I'm the CEO of Cultural Vistas, and I'm also an alumnus of the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship Program. And on behalf of Cultural Vistas and the Robert Bosch Foundation Alumni Association, again, want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. I know it's a busy time of the year with all the holiday festivities, but we really appreciate that you're all here to join us, and also want to welcome everybody who's on YouTube. For those of you who would like to join the conversation online, we ask that you tweet the hashtag with refugees, and so when we get to the discussion session, we'll be able to bring that into our conversation. We're really pleased tonight that we're able to co-sponsor the event with the RBFAA, and really appreciate all the support and collaboration that we have with the Robert Bosch Foundation Alumni Association, not only on tonight's event, but on many events that we do throughout the year. For those of you who are less familiar about Cultural Vistas, we're a nonprofit exchange organization that works to promote global understanding and collaboration amongst individuals and institutions. We organize a variety of professionally oriented experiences that bring people together to share best practices and learn about differing practices in their professional fields. And we believe truly that through our programs that we're empowering individuals to do positive change, not only for themselves individually, but for their organizations and society at large. And through a variety of about 30 different programs, we serve 6,000 students, professionals, and emerging leaders each year from the United States and 135 different countries around the world. And we have a number of alumni and participants with us this evening, so we're glad that we have that. This year, Cultural Vistas administered a program called the Welcoming Communities Transatlantic Exchange that we did together with Welcoming America and the Heinrich Bull Foundation North America, with funding from the German Economics Ministry, as well as the US State Department, the Robert Bosch Foundation, and the BMW Group. And the focus of this program was to increase the capacity of local integration practitioners in local communities to share best practices and learn how individuals and communities were dealing with the refugee crisis and situation in Germany and the United States. And we selected 25 Germans and 16 Americans from 3 to 5 communities on each side, and they did a 1-week or 10-day exchange in each direction. And we did it last year, or I should say this year. It was quite successful. It culminated in a wonderful transatlantic symposium with the US ambassador in Berlin, where they were able to share their best practices and action plans that they had developed. And we are intending to do this program again in 2017 and 2018. Right now we're in the application process. And the Americans, the Germans, will be coming here at the end of April and the beginning of May. So hopefully some of the folks here in the room will have an opportunity to meet with them. And then the Americans will be headed over to Germany in November of 2017. So we're really excited about that particular initiative, and that's what brings us to this evening. Our involvement in that project, as well as obviously this critical issue, the refugee situation that is not going away anytime soon, sadly. We felt that this topic is incredibly important for us as a community in the exchange community. So we hope that by bringing together 4 knowledgeable experts and individuals on this topic, we can start having more of a conversation about how individuals, organizations, exchange alumni, and citizen diplomats can get more involved in supporting refugees and help create welcoming communities wherever they live here in the United States, regardless of some of the rhetoric that we've heard in the recent election and some of the changing events that are happening around the world. So I really want to thank our moderator, Sumi, who's with us this evening, who's going to take over in just a minute, and our 3 panelists, Ruben, Jennifer, and Monica, for taking time out of your very busy schedules to share your ideas and thoughts with us this evening. And I also have to thank Sumi, who came all the way from Berlin for this. It's a little exaggerated. She was here on a trip already, but she still has a very busy schedule, so we're glad that you could be with us tonight. And I should also mention that Sumi is a Robert Bosch alumna as well, and spent a year over in Germany, and maybe you'll mention that a little bit more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sumi and look forward to the conversation. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Rob, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I also want to give my thanks to the Robert Bosch Foundation and Cultural Vistas for organizing and hosting this event. I had the good fortune to be at that symposium that Rob had mentioned with welcoming communities, and was able to see just from the outside what kind of knowledge and experience was channeled through these groups, and things, as Rob said, best practices and the challenges that stakeholders and communities in Germany and America face. And that was in September. The times weren't as uncertain then as they are now. So I think those types of civil society initiatives are especially important. So very happy to have Monica from Welcoming America, Ruben from IRC, and Jennifer from Global Ties to talk about those. Before we talk about the community solutions, Ruben, maybe we can start with the very first part of the process of refugee resettlement, which is, of course, where refugees begin. And your organization, the IRC, is very active on the ground in places like Greece and in Turkey, where refugees are arriving still on a daily basis. What are the basic challenges that they face besides food and shelter in terms of resettlement, and what are their prospects?
Well, as you know, there are almost 60 million refugees in the world today, and I think by definition, refugees are fleeing persecution and terror. And when they arrive in places like Greece after a harrowing journey across the Aegean Sea, the least of their problems is food, clothing, and shelter, because they're thinking about their future. And the prospect of traveling to Europe now being shut down in many cases, many refugees in Greece are essentially in a state of limbo, not knowing what their next step is going to be. And so the conditions in these refugee camps, in spite of best efforts, are quite atrocious. And the prospect for them trying to hold on to hope diminishes by the day. There is no other way to characterize the situation than to say that it's very bleak. Similarly, refugees who are trying to cross the Mediterranean are also facing crisis in terms of human trafficking and exploitation, and quite many perishing in the journey.
The European Union, of course, committed to resettling many more refugees than they actually have. For those who do make it to that stage of being resettled in the US, if I can follow up, Ruben, on that, you were very active in the resettlement of, or continue to be active in the resettlement of refugees in Maryland. How many, for example, have arrived this year, and how is your organization aiding them in getting settled?
Yeah, so Maryland has resettled approximately 2,500 refugees in federal fiscal year 16, which ended in September, of which the IRC resettled about 1,900. More or less, Maryland is a pretty progressive state, in spite of Governor Hogan coming out and making a statement that he does not want Syrian refugees coming into the state. The climate for resettlement is quite strong, with lots of community partners coming in to assist. The basic services that we provide include finding folks housing before they arrive, helping them to find work, access English classes, address their healthcare needs, and beginning to slowly integrate socially and economically.
Jennifer, how has a refugee resettlement tied into the work that Global Ties is doing in local communities in the U.S.?
Sure, thanks. First, I just want to thank Cultural Vistas for hosting this, being part of this panel. So Global Ties oversees a network of organizations all across the country, 45 states, and almost 90 different communities. And they're involved in this in two ways. First is these nonprofit organizations really serve as kind of global hubs within their communities. They bring the community together to talk about, engage on global issues. So really trying to internationalize communities, if you will. So in that role, there's about a dozen or so of the 90 that are actually refugee resettlement agencies. So they're doing the work that IRC is doing. The rest of them are doing a lot of kind of peripheral work that provides language training, mentoring, integration of just helping these individuals feel welcome in their communities and engaging them in different events that they have on a regular basis. And the stakeholders that these member organizations engage are people that are very internationally minded. So refugees have a very welcome place because within the networks of our member organizations, because these are very internationally minded people that are very concerned about making sure that schools, governments have a very global mindset, and to be able to engage with refugees helps develop that further. The second way in which our member organizations are involved is they are hosting international exchange delegations on a regular basis, primarily funded and supported by the U.S. Department of State. One of their flagship professional exchange programs brings leaders from around the world to the U.S. for a 3-week program. Our members are implementing a number of projects of leaders that are working on migration and refugee resettlement issues from around the world, lots coming from Europe, clearly, and really engaging with these delegations on how is the U.S. and how are U.S. communities really looking at this issue and integrating refugees. So it's kind of that very local kind of grassroots of working with refugees, but also helping build the capacity of leaders that around the world who are doing this work.
Monica, we heard a bit about Welcoming America from Rob's remarks in the Welcoming Communities exchange. How does refugee resettlement play into that network of cities, and what are some of the practices that these communities are carrying out to make sure that they become more welcoming communities for refugees who are resettled there?
Sure. So our organization, Welcoming America, we were founded in 2009 with the premise of immigrants and refugees. They can't really thrive and integrate if you're not engaging the receiving community. So if you haven't had those conversations with the long-term residents, with municipal governments, with business leaders, with the folks who were there before, you're never going to integrate. People, it's challenging seeing the rapid demographic change that's happening across the country. And if you don't address it, the prospects aren't going to be as high. So one way that we work really closely with refugee resettlement agencies is they're part of the local solution. So we work with over 100 cities and counties across the country. In addition, we work with other NGOs, but particularly through the cities and counties, what we really encourage is a strategic plan. So pulling together civil society and municipal government to really think through, well, what is it that we can be doing as a community to help the integration of immigrant and refugees, looking from access to services, community engagement, public safety, entrepreneurship, and education. And Baltimore is a perfect example of a community that has gone through just that kind of planning, and IRC was a part of the development of those strategies of what can they be doing as a city to really move the ball forward. So I think that process can't really happen without the engagement of the practitioners who really know best of what are the circumstances individuals face, as well as some of the individuals who are most affected.
When looking at those kind of core elements of refugee resettlement that you mentioned, including education and access to services, Monica, maybe you can start talking about the challenges that some of these community faces in those very first steps in resettlement. What are the biggest stumbling blocks that the communities your organization works with face?
Well, one thing we're hearing right now is a lot of our communities are having a lot of issues with anti-Muslim backlash. They're seeing an uptick right now in intimidation, and that's a real challenge when you're trying to say I'm a welcoming place, when the exact opposite is happening in your community as well. So we actually have a program through ORR where we're providing support for our members to kind of look through some of these challenges in terms of welcoming refugees. We even have a website, welcomingrefugees.org, if you want to learn more. But I think that's been one of the big challenges right now, and people are taking different steps in trying to figure out how to address it. I was sharing with them earlier the example of Boise, Idaho, where they actually have a police liaison to work specifically with refugee communities. Someone who goes in there in plain clothes to build relationships, because refugees need to know that they have someone there on their side as well. And oftentimes they're coming from countries where there's not a good relationship with law enforcement. So how do you deal with some of these cultural barriers and differences to really help folks integrate and feel safe? in their communities. So that's something that a lot of our members are starting to think through, is what are the resources we have that we can deploy to really help folks feel like they're welcome in our communities.
Ruben, you mentioned earlier as we were speaking that a lot of members of the community are interested in engaging, and they would like, for example, to mentor refugees, but there is no official program for sponsorship of refugees. And that's a case in Germany as well, where the efforts of volunteers has been a backbone of creating welcoming communities there. Is that something that has been a stumbling block, would you say, for IRC and in resettling refugees in general?
Absolutely. You know, we've been, the International Rescue Committee has been resettling refugees in the state for about 17 years, and we've established quite a few community partnerships. And in spite of the kind of Islamophobia and the xenophobia that's happening, there's hundreds of people like you who have reached out to the IRC and other resettlement agencies saying, hey, what can we do to help, right? What can we donate money? Can we donate time? Many want to adopt a family, right? And I think our capacity is limited because it's difficult to coordinate one-on-one relationships with hundreds of people and then match them with individual families without an adequate vetting system and then adequate support. So we created a family mentor program a few years ago that's very, very successful. It essentially recruits individuals from the community like you, and you commit to a 6-month time period, and we would match you with a specific family, and then you begin the process of mentoring them. It could be simple things like teaching them English about 2 hours a week, or teaching them how to ride the metro from point A to point B, helping them with a resume, helping them to find work in coordination with the resettlement organization. But providing ongoing support to the family mentors takes time, and we don't have the resources to scale it. So while there are hundreds of incidences of hate crimes across the country, there are thousands of incidences of people coming out and saying we support refugees, but we don't have the infrastructure in place to garner that support and make it an effective tool. So I think there's a great room for foundations to play a role in building up the capacity of resettlement agencies to be able to engage and capture this energy.
Jennifer, we were speaking a bit earlier about, your organization works with refugee resettlement agencies in various communities, and we're speaking about the importance of having support often from the top. So from municipal authorities, from a mayor's office, for example. Where are the communities where you've seen that work, and when it hasn't worked, what have been some of the solutions there?
So, I mean, you take a look at the work that Welcoming America is doing and engaging mayors across the country. It's very, very impressive, and there's an amazing amount of commitment and support from kind of the top, whether it's the mayor's office or the governor's office, and really great innovative examples of organizations, or I'm sorry, of sort of that top level leadership that really galvanizes support within a community. So we were talking earlier about when you sort of need both in instances of where the leadership is really driving the change, and if that's not necessarily the case, then you need sort of that bottom-up approach. And in some instances in the cities where our members are located, you've got this amazing amount of kind of community support and effort around helping to integrate refugees that then kind of drives the top down. So my point earlier was just it's important to have both, and when one is stronger than the other, it helps kind of sort of rebalance that effort.
When we talked about, again, those kind of fundamental elements of what refugees need to be provided when in the beginning of those first steps, education, of course, is one of them. And Jennifer, I know you've done a lot of work on education and exchanges in the past. In Germany, when young refugees arrive, up until the age of around 16, they're placed in something called a welcome class in a school, which is essentially a parallel class that runs parallel to the regular school program, where young refugee children are taught German and then essentially integrated into the school's ecosystem. Within 6 months to a year, just depending on the school, on the community, on the state. How, Jennifer, if you could tell us, how does that work generally here? What are the opportunities of education for people who are just arriving, and then also the prospects for entering the workforce?
So I can talk a little bit about some sort of examples of from an educational perspective, looking at there has been a school so Buffalo, New York is very, very proactive and very advanced in kind of welcoming refugees, and they have started a school that really focuses on 50% of the population are immigrants or refugees, and they've developed a whole kind of curriculum around embracing kind of the whole student, and not only educating them and getting them up to speed from a language perspective, but also a whole person perspective of how do you culturally integrate. So I think there are some really unique models from an educational perspective. On the employment side, and I know Ruben can speak to this better, one of the areas of, frankly, concern and sort of a stumbling block is refugees that are coming that are highly skilled, highly trained, and are not able to translate their degrees or their training into full employment here. So you've got doctors and others that have certifications from abroad that just frankly don't translate here. So the whole question around credentialing is a big issue for us in the U.S. And there are a number of universities around the country and other institutions that are really trying to address this problem of kind of full employment of people that have a tremendous amount of skills. And I know my colleagues can speak to that a little bit further.
Yeah, Monica, you were mentioning earlier brain waste is something that you've been talking about in the communities that Welcoming America works with, and that's a big issue, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue, and a report, MPI just put out a report, I think it was last week, really looking at this brain waste issue. And I think, if I recall correctly, it goes by state of what a state is losing in terms of the brain waste, because refugees are not, they're not matching up jobs that match up their education level that they're bringing from their home country. It's a different way of applying for a job, even in terms of the most simple form of a resume. Here, we don't put pictures on our resumes. In many countries, you do. And that's just a total mismatch. And if you don't have someone advising you and helping you through the process, it's very challenging. Though I was talking to Ruben, and it sounds like IRC is doing a lot of interesting work, so I think he's actually better. Yeah. Position too.
Well, actually, I'll give you a negative example. A couple of years ago, I met a refugee who was from Iraq, and Mohammed was a civil engineer, and he worked with the U.S. troops to help rebuild the country during the invasion occupation. And when the U.S. withdrew, he was under threat, and so he had to leave the country, and he came into the U.S. And the first job that we were able to get him was working in a parking lot, right? And he worked there for a number of years, and he did very well. And after 2 years, he was like running 4 or 5 of them. And then I happened to take him into a meeting with a local foundation so he could tell a story of exactly this issue of how qualified he is, but even though he loves his work, he's working in a parking lot. And the president of the foundation then said, "Oh, I know the CEO of such and such a construction company, and I'm going to make the introduction." And he did. And after 2 months, the company picked him up. And now he's practicing his skills. He has to go through some training. The company's investing in him. But I heard from them, a few weeks ago, and they were saying, how grateful they are for having found Mohammed, because he's leading a whole team of engineers. And so there are hundreds of examples like that across the country of talent that goes wasted. And the connection point between a refugee who comes here with high degree of skill and say a recertification system is very problematic. And I think if we invested in that, we'd see a huge benefit.
Well, it's been a big struggle I can say in Germany as well, and that has been changed in the legislation. Whereas when refugees arrived in the first influx in 2015, they were often sitting around for 6 months to a year to even 2 years. Whereas now the legislation has been changed so that those who have the prospect of staying can work as soon as 3 months if they fill out the requisite paperwork, which is then, of course, the other issue. But Monica, looking at some of the exchanges that that Welcoming America has led, how effective is it to have mayors working together? What kind of expertise are they sharing, and how has that been effective in creating more welcoming communities?
Sure. I mean, you think about what the assets are of getting a mayor involved, and I think one of the first that comes to mind is a bully pulpit. They have a very unique position in the community to have the bully pulpit and to be the ones really setting the tone for the community. They also have the convening power of that they can bring different stakeholders together in a way that an NGO might not be able to. They can bring together big business, they can bring together the philanthropy, they can bring together NGOs in a way that another entity might not be able to. We're seeing more and more, a lot of mayors starting to engage in advocacy. There was, I know, a letter very recently signed by a bunch of mayors to the transition team regarding saving the DACA students. And they're going at it from the angle of these kids are in our communities. They went through our schools. They're getting an education. We're going to stand up and fight for these kids. So I think, we've seen a lot of things shifting to the city level anyway in the past few years. But no one, I think, ever thought immigration would be something that mayors would be engaged in. But what you're really looking at is the integration of a bunch of your residents. And that's something that mayors do. They do focus on, creating communities where people can thrive. And what we're encouraging them to do is to think about your community as a place that's diverse and includes immigrants and refugees who bring a unique set of skills, but do need a little extra help in some areas.
I want to ask all three of you, we're talking about initiatives to help refugees, for example, access health, education, work. What about the other side of the discussion? How do you create a welcoming community, especially if there's skepticism, maybe even fear about newcomers coming to a town where perhaps they don't have experience? For example, in Germany, in the east of the country, these are towns that simply don't have experience with foreigners. They were isolated for a long period of time, and the anti-foreigner sentiment and xenophobia can in some ways be traced back to that history. What about here? How can organizations like yours work to engage the community better and make it more welcoming?
So I can give an example of how our organization actually got started. Back in earlier 2000s, Tennessee was facing a really terrible time. There were mosques that were being burned. They were facing English-only legislation. And our executive director at the time was living in Tennessee, and what he realized was no one was having those hard conversations with the people who were living in those communities. No one was asking the long-term residents, like, what's going on? Like, why are you afraid of your neighbor? And he basically realized that, like, without engaging that receiving community piece, you were never really going to make a welcoming community. So through a lot of hard work and a lot of dialogues and engaging leadership and doing positive communications campaigns, Nashville, Tennessee went from a place where they were burning mosques and about to pass an English-only legislation to defeating English-only, to now having a mayor's office of New Americans in Nashville, Tennessee. So you can see a community going from being fearful to being tolerant to being welcoming, but it doesn't happen overnight. And I think we just have to be really real with ourselves that people have legitimate fears. And if you don't address those legitimate fears, if you do not do the hard work of having some of these dialogues, things aren't going to change.
Yeah, and I think on the flip side of that, to share the Baltimore example, I think you also have to engage people's hopes. And I was sharing earlier that, in the post-civil rights era, Baltimore lost about 300,000 people as the city began to experience Black leadership and people, African Americans taking leadership positions within the city. There was a lot of white flight. And you found by the year 2000, Baltimore was a city built for 900,000 people, but with a tax base of about 600,000 or 700,000. And what both Baltimore residents needed more than anything else is people, right, to come in and rent apartments and start businesses and buy homes and make Main Street live again. And I think that's what's happened in the last 10 years is that to the extent that Baltimore's began to see an increase in population, it's precisely because of mayors and other administrations saying, listen, this is a welcoming city. We're not going to enforce immigration laws. We welcome newcomers, and the rate of population increase is driven by immigrants and refugees making it their home. And lots of little policies at the neighborhood level that encourage home ownership, micro enterprise development are beginning to make this change happen. So there's a practical way to do this.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, I think ultimately people are kind of selfish about like what's in it for me. And I think what a number of mayors have been doing is really looking at refugees and immigrants as economic drivers for local communities, and where the most amount of job creation happens is through small businesses. And the more that we can leverage from an economic standpoint, because that's what people care about, and that's certainly what we heard in this election of, I need a job or I need a better job, that really kind of leveraging and maximizing what refugees and immigrants can bring to communities from an economic driver perspective, I think is smart, and will be effective in getting people to really see the value of it. Secondarily, what we find a lot, and we have over 40,000 volunteers across the country that engage with the exchange programs that our members implement. And one of the biggest reasons why those individuals are involved is because they want to expose their children to kind of the global world. And if we can articulate and really show that refugees and immigrants are an asset to helping our communities be more global and be more aware and engaged, to be more competitive in the global marketplace. And again, that's sort of what's in it for me, argument as to why and how communities can be more welcoming if they see themselves in that rationale as to why a community can and should embrace these individuals.
Jennifer, how much of a resource have existing immigrant communities been in cities in making these communities more welcoming?
I would say significant. I mean, I've been to, so many different cities around the country who I can't say how many immigrants, not necessarily recent refugees, but immigrants who are on the boards of directors of our member organizations who are incredibly successful. Left their countries for a myriad of reasons, and have kind of built businesses and have become major players in their local communities. So I just see success story after success story, and there's an individual from an Iraqi Christian on our advisory council who I have to say is more American than any of us in the room, because he believes so strongly in the opportunity that he had to come here as a university student, and does everything he can to build his community in Detroit, and commit to it and engage with it. So there just are so many incredible stories about people that really embrace the American dream and make something of it, and give back to their community because they've had such an amazing experience.
One of the many fault lines that was exposed during this US election campaign, and also in Germany, is the urban-rural divide. And you do see, for example, refugees in Germany much more willing to be resettled to a place like Berlin, of course, or to a place like Munich, because there are existing immigrant populations, but also because they tend to be more welcoming communities. And the xenophobic attacks that Germany has witnessed have then been in small towns, where, again, as I said, they don't necessarily have experience with foreigners. Monica, in the case of the communities that Welcoming America is working with, how much has that been an issue?
Well, I mean, it's all anecdotal, right? Like, I think right now we're hearing from everyone just fear. We're hearing an uptick in hate crimes and intimidation and bullying. But what I was also saying is, like, we have a lot of places that are smaller in population, don't have a large refugee population, but have the opportunity to be innovative, right? You can try a lot more different kind of cool programs when you're not dealing with a super large population to see what works. I was giving the example of Anchorage, Alaska, where you wouldn't think, but Anchorage, Alaska has been resettling refugees now for a little bit of time. And they have newcomer centers. So they have, similar to what she was mentioning with Berlin, young people will go to these welcome centers. So they will all have that English support. anywhere up to 2 years. And what it also does is provide them mentors and teachers and a way of feeling a part of the community. And they're looking for a way to create wraparound services to also engage the parents of these refugee children. So we see smaller communities like that trying different kinds of programming to better support refugee families. While the metrics aren't there yet, like, it's at least very reaffirming to hear that, you know, folks are looking at their resources and figuring out what they can do, even if their immigrant refugee population isn't huge. It's still a very important part of their community for them.
We were also speaking a bit earlier about when we talk about the U.S. election, these are uncertain times, and you do often need the cooperation and the willingness to work with the municipal administration and community, but also federal government. And these resettlement programs we're talking about are very much in question in the coming 4 years. How much does that affect all of your work? Ruben.
I was hoping you'd pass the mic. Well, you know, it's really hard to know, you know, what the next administration will bring. I think the bipartisan support that refugee resettlement has enjoyed in the post-World War II era has really come under fire in the last decade or so. You know, post 9/11, you know, the refugee resettlement program tanked, and it took us 10 years to rebuild it back up to pre 9/11 numbers. You know, it's really hard to imagine refugee resettlement being shut down, given that the scale of the refugee crisis continues to grow, right? When the environmental crisis really hits, that will only magnify 10, 100-fold. So I think there's a lot of serious thinking that needs to be done in terms of how we will develop policies to preserve the rights of refugees. And now is not the time to back away from our commitment as a country that has welcomed people fleeing persecution.
Jennifer, just briefly, because we're going to open up to some questions. Is it possible to put policies and programs in place that can survive a 4-year administration, or however long an administration is?
So I think, I mean, the answer, yes, but I think, you know, if we're speaking very specifically about refugee resettlement, that is, you know, State Department funded, it's mandated. So if funding gets cut there, would be a significant decrease in the number of refugees that are resettled. Now, if we're talking about refugees that have been recently resettled here, or immigrants, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of work that can continue to go on. Particularly, I was talking about, you know, the ongoing effort to provide educational training opportunities for the individuals that have come recently. But I mean, the spigot could easily be cut off. That would affect directly in significant ways organizations like Ruben's and our members who receive federal funding to do the work of refugee resettlement.
I think we're going to see if there's any questions from any of you for our panelists. Any questions or comments for that matter? Don't be shy.
Yeah, I'm Catherine Stratus. Just how dependent are you on federal funding in percentages in terms of your programs?
Resettlement, I'd say, is about 80% funded by public dollars. So it's a combination of federal, state, local dollars, and about 20% private money, right? So it's definitely a state-sponsored system. Having signed the Refugee Convention in the 80s, the U.S. made the commitment to take a number of refugees, and that's the system we have in place now.
I mean, we have a grant with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, but the bulk of our funding doesn't come from the federal government. I think the part that, on a personal level, that we're struggling with is we had an MOU with this administration. We were helping them think through like federal immigrant integration. We were coming up with transition plans of how federal agencies could support local immigrant integration efforts based on the lessons learned from the Obama administration in the past year and a half. All of that the next day it was tanked. So I think, like everyone else, we're recalibrating. But I think in terms of the federal government piece, it was that opportunity that we foresaw to be proactive and really start getting some local resources to the local level where integration happens, that we're no longer seeing as a possibility.
So we're about 80% funded by federal government, significant. So, we're being very, very proactive and looking at other sources of revenue to build the sustainability.
Any other questions?
I'm Howard Wallach, and I'm a board member of Cultural Vistas. Listening to the four of you, you use some interesting nomenclature. You talk about refugees, you talk about immigrants, you talk about newcomers. And I just want to share a quick story. 20 years ago, I worked for the Peace Corps of the Dominican Republic as a staffer, and we brought volunteers in, and they said they were volunteers. The communities there had a lot of trouble understanding their roles. And when we said, tell them you're technical advisors or technical consultants, the whole thing changed. Does the nomenclature that we use in communities to describe people, refugees, affect the way they are integrated in communities? Because it talks about what they've left behind and not what they've chosen to come to the United States to pursue. And are any programs looking at not only, they've had terrible lives and terrible challenges, and we can't diminish that because there are certain needs, trauma, health, education. But is there a way to change the dialogue and look to the future that would help communities embrace people more, as opposed to having fear or doubt or now growing xenophobia?
A small example would be that, so I was in Nashville up until yesterday, and the mayor of Nashville was talking about how she sees them as new Americans. Immigrants and refugees are new Americans. They have an office of new Americans in Nashville, and that name is very much on purpose, because in her mind, any immigrant or refugee who's in her city, it's a new American. A lot of cities have taken that perspective. I think Boston, they have the Office of New Bostonians. Chicago is also the Office of New Americans. So, folks are thinking about that. I think another challenge, we had this conversation with a few nonprofits that were thinking about communications the other day. Every word has now become political. Like, how do you talk about diversity or welcoming or inclusive when they all now have a political label? So what are we left with? Right? I think that's a challenge that we're all trying to think through, is how do we now talk about these things and not make it immediately political? And if anyone has ideas, I am open to them.
Ruben has that maybe, or Jen?
No, please go.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think you have to tailor your comments to the audience. I think the new Americans, I think is probably the best term to use. Although having said that, I think it is important. I think people do want to hear about the experiences of people who have fled persecution. People who've been denied fundamental kind of human rights. I always say, I'm a dad. I have an 8-year-old son, and if I had to flee with my son, and he hadn't had the opportunity to go to school for a decade, and then I came to a country like this, and I was able to get my first paycheck and buy him a pair of shoes and take him to school, how motivated do you think I would be? When employers hear that story, and this is a real story, they want to do more, right? Because they connect to that. So I don't think it's always necessary to run away from that title, because it reflects a reality and a passion to rebuild life, which I think is what these people bring.
Any other questions or comments? I'm Holly Herrera, and I'm with PRM, and I'm just I'm fascinated by how a group like Welcoming America can go into a community. I understand working with mayors and law enforcement and so on, but you have groups of citizens in communities who have really discovered what a refugee is and what a Syrian refugee is specifically, and are often up in arms. So I'm curious, and I know Welcoming America often pays visits to communities to help them strategize about how to deal with this. And that's more on that particular factor that I'm wondering how you work with the local refugee resettlement programs to address.
Yeah, so, our thinking is it needs to come from the ground up, right? So we're not going to go into a community and tell a mayor you have to do this. Like, a mayor is going to approach us. And oftentimes it's going to be with the backing of civil society, or civil society has decided that they wanted to put pressure on the mayor to do something like this. I think things like that, it goes back to those very basics of getting to know one another, right? Like, a lot of these communities will host dinners, or they will use schools to get people talking to one another. Yeah, we will go in and do technical assistance and support. But at the end of the day, I think so much of it comes down to so many like basic principles of humanity and getting to those root causes. So, I mean, there's no one size fits all. But what we are seeing is that there have been great benefits in being able to bring the community together. And even if it's through cultural celebrations and starting to demonstrate who a Syrian refugee is, what their food is like, what the culture is like, because people are afraid of the unknown. So if you can start addressing that unknown factor and, you know, chipping away at it, I think that's a lot of where communities have seen success.
Questions? I'll play devil's advocate here for a minute. How do you convince a native-born American who's looking for a job or looking for a better paying job that taking refugees in is a good idea? Any takers?
You know, I think that's a very good question. And, you know, what I've found is that it's really important to communicate that refugees are like everybody else, right? They've come to this country looking for opportunity, and that there is opportunity to be taken. So, you know, there's lots of resources available in the U.S. for people who are looking for work. You know, oftentimes, and I get this question quite a bit in Baltimore. We resettle in an area of Baltimore that, you know, has its own struggles. And people come up to my office and say, you know, I'm looking for work as well. And I say, well, let's go. I'll connect you to the resources and let's see what we can do. Right. So it's not for the lack of resources. I think that I'm not saying that, you know, there aren't inequalities in this country and that not everybody has the same shot to getting to where you want to go. But I think if you're looking for work, there's opportunities for it, and there are resources for it.
I mean, I would agree with that. Some of our member organizations who provide like job training services, they're serving the wider community. They're not just serving the refugee population. So, you know, it may be that 40% of their clients are refugees, but the rest they're providing. So that kind of holistic approach and services sort of addresses the question of, hey, the service, to your point, the service is available to you as well. So it's up to you to kind of maximize it.
Yes. Any more questions? Okay. I think Rob had something to say.
Sorry. Well, thank you so much for an engaging discussion this evening. I just really want to express our thanks. I think this is a clear example of an incredible global issue that we're all trying to deal with, and all of your organizations are really inspiring to hear all of the things that you're doing at the local level. I mean, again, here's a global challenge and another example of how important it is that each of us as individuals in our local communities are playing a role to come up with a solution. And I just want to thank, again, Global Ties, IRC, and Welcoming Americas for the great work you're doing. And Sumi, to you bringing attention to this issue in the work that you do at Deutsche Welle and in the media, which is so very critical for us all to hear about it. So please, a big round of applause. One of the things that I was thinking about as I listened to you all is, what role can we all play here as exchange alumni and participants? And there's obviously a lot of overlap. I mean, I think almost everybody in this room, and hopefully folks that are watching, have spent time overseas and understand the challenges that one faces just as an exchange participant, the newness of a culture and adjusting to a different way of living. And obviously, if you're a refugee or an immigrant, it's that much bigger. So I think my call to everybody who's been part of tonight's event is that we all need to remember that and commit. We're in the holiday season here where it's a time of giving. It's time to make your New Year's resolution. I think we all should commit to doing something in our local communities, understanding what we've experienced as exchange participants, that we can be giving back to this very important topic. Last but not least, I want to thank Richard Bobo, who's our alumni relations coordinator over there, and all of my team at Cultural coordinating this evening. Again, it was a wonderful discussion. We're glad that you could be here. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the evening. We have lots of food and drink as well. So I wish you all happy holidays and a very happy New Year.